up and running. All right, I believe we are live, just waiting for the LinkedIn to come up. There we go. All right, now we are live. All right, fantastic. All right, so again, thank you guys very much for another Pay Practitioners panel. We're working through some technical difficulties. As we're talking about the globalization of the workforce, I think we can also, talk about the globalization of time zones. That seemed to throw us for a loop this time around. So thanks everybody for bearing with us as we got this one set up. So again, today we are going to talk about the globalization of the workforce and what that means to compensation practitioners and what our role should be. One of the things I'm excited for is we have a special guest speaker today. We have Warren Heaps of the Burgess Group. So we will go ahead and get started with a quick round of introductions about who we are. I will go first, then we'll just go clockwise. But my name, I'm Justin Hampton. I'm the founder of Comp Tool. Been doing compensation for about 15 years and started the Comp Tool with Squirrel a few years ago, and really kind of found that I wanted to make sure I could keep talking about comp. And so I have found a handful of awesome consultants and pay practitioners to chat with every couple of weeks, and we stream these live for everybody to watch. So thank you guys for joining us. Catherine, how about you?
Oh, hi, I'm Catherine Dovey. I've been doing comp consulting for about 25 years. I do broad-based comp. I also do a lot of family offices and closely held privately owned companies and nonprofit exec comp as well. And I'm thrilled to be here. I love talking about this. This is my favorite subject. So thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure.
Hi, I'm Sherry Nornis, and I'm going to go over to Catherine's for Thanksgiving because she likes to talk about comp, and that'll be good stuff to talk at the dinner table. But anyway, I'm a principal consultant with Morgan HR, and we're kind of a boutique compensation firm that offers a lot to our clients. So we have HR consulting, which is our big umbrella. Then we also have Simply Merit, which is a compensation planning tool. And to lead into that, we have leadership development and training and education, which is our Comp Aware program. And then we also have Hire Comp, which is HIRE Comp, where we have a pool of candidates that we can help our clients or other companies source good compensation talent for their roles. So I'm happy to be here. Love talking about globalization of comp. I've been doing comp for over 30 years. So I have worked in a number of global companies over the decades.
I want to point out one of the really cool things about Morgan HR is Laura. Laura was actually a compensation practitioner that started a software company that helps solve problems. So I always kind of love that, there's that insight from people that have actually been working from the same seats and solving the same problems. So I love that part about Morgan HR.
Yep.
Greg.
Greg Roche, VP of Comp with Optum Health, and I've been doing comp for about as long as you, Justin, about 15 years. And so focus mostly on healthcare jobs in my current role, and always happy to talk to other people about what they're doing and come up with new ideas.
That's fantastic. And Warren, our guest speaker today. Tell us a little bit about yourself and Burgess Group.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Warren Heaps, I'm a partner at Burgess Group. We're a small HR consulting firm that specializes in helping organizations that work in developing countries. We have a salary survey program that covers about 170 places around the world. We also have a platform called Community, which includes job design and job evaluation, skills assessment, and performance management. It's really we think one of the only holistic approaches to all those things, because that tends to be a siloed thing in most organizations. And like most of you, I've been working in comp and benefits for a long time. the gray hair probably gives it away, but probably over 40 years with Towers and with Colgate-Palmolive, and for about 17 and a half years with Birch's Group. One of the interesting things about my colleagues at Birch's Group is that they together ran an internal department within the United Nations Development Program for about 25 years, managing the field compensation in the field arm of the UN system. So while I have some interesting stories, my colleagues have stories like, oh yeah, we were the first ones on the ground in Afghanistan when the Russians withdrew, or stories about riding on the back of a truck from Lagos to Abuja in Nigeria and not getting killed. So if you need, war stories for comp people, I can refer you to my colleagues.
Wow. Well, no. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you so much for joining the conversation today. I think it'll
Happy
be
to be here.
well, great. Well, a couple of weeks or about a week ago or so, we asked, what should we talk about? And there's a number of things that I think we can certainly talk about. But let's start off with one of the most commonly requested one, and that is setting pay philosophies for global organizations. And how should we do that? When does it make sense? What are the pros and cons to doing so? I have seen myself personally with some global companies I've worked for that trying to really kind of align a U.S. centric approach in different countries really kind of creates some challenges in terms of making sure that you can create a culture that is driving and engaging employees. Curious of the group, what kind of practices have you guys seen and that have worked effectively when aligning compensation philosophies across multiple parts of the world? Or do we think it's a good idea?
Well,
those are both good questions. Take a crack at it just to get us started. But those are great questions, because we're in countries today that we would never have thought of going into 10 or 15 years ago to get talent. Now we're able to do that. So it's really putting a pressure on how we're going to explain the differences in the compensation to our employees, to have them embrace that, you're working for a US company, or you're working for a UK based company. How are we going to personalize that compensation statement that allows the people in the other companies, the employees in your other areas, to actually feel part of the bigger group? And I have to tell you, I don't necessarily have the answers. I lean in quite a bit to the executive leadership in those companies to try to get the diversity component of the different pay levels and how we pay people and the cost of labor. It's a tricky question that has to be addressed in a comp philosophy. And one, fortunately, through pay transparency, we're now able to say, you know what, the cost of labor is lower there. You're not going to be paid the same as someone here. Or maybe we are going to pay you the same. And really, is that the right thing to do from a cost for the overall organization? So it's a tricky one. If anyone on the panel has the answer, I'm right here to listen.
Well, I don't really have answers, but observations. We work with a lot of clients that operate obviously across a vast number of markets. And when we build a comp philosophy, we try to do it in such a way that it really focuses on, and it's a philosophy, not a policy. Mm-hmm. And we deliberately choose the word philosophy because we want it to be sort of high level conceptual, principle based, mm-hmm, as opposed to prescriptive. Because the first observation I'd make is that countries are different. Even bordering countries are different. And, you have to sort of, I call it the culture of compensation. The fact that, around the world, there are statutory practices that vary. There are cultural practices that vary. One of the stories I like to tell is the, the very large technology company that thought they could go into Africa and just pay salary and not have any allowances. And when their compensation manager told me that that was the order from on high, he was, I think, from Mozambique, but based in South Africa. And he and I both agreed that it was a prescription for trouble. And 3 years later, sure enough, they came back and said, "Hey, we need to look at our allowances because we've been losing a lot of people in various places across the continent because we only pay base salary." So that would be one of my observations, is that you can have a pay philosophy that's sort of overarching and captures from a principled perspective that you want to use cost of labor, that you want to use a defined set of comparators, that you want to define how you're going to take performance into account, or how your job levels are going to be defined. But when it comes down to setting the pay scales and the pay mix, you also need to take into account the local practice. So I like philosophy at the global level and then kind of local color, if you will.
Yeah, and that's really true. And I think then to add on to that piece is making sure that our leadership have the skills to be able to explain that to their employees who are in 4 or 5 different countries, right? And it's complex. And I think if we just own the complexity a bit and say we're not all going to be paid the same.
Well, how do you answer the question, Shari, that we get a lot? How come if I'm sitting in Nairobi as a local employee and I'm making $75,000 in shillings, whatever that is, how come the Australian expat who's in the same job level doing the same job I'm doing, but because they're from Australia and they're not from Kenya, they're getting paid 3 times more? That's not equitable.
It's not equitable, is it? And
Well,
it's hard.
it depends how you define equity. Does equity mean sameness or fairness?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Equal or
No.
equitable, right?
Yeah.
Different.
Yep, very different. Catherine?
Yeah, I know you guys have all heard this, but years ago, I believe it was Microsoft, so don't quote me on this, but when they were issuing their stock options, they said, look, everybody's working for the same company. We all get the same. So they issued stock options to everybody worldwide at the same rate. They basically effectively made millionaires out of the software engineers. This was years ago, probably 25 years ago, but they effectively made millionaires out of all of their software engineers in India, and they ended up losing all that talent because none of those people ever had to work again. So I think there's a real danger in, I really love the egalitarian, let's give everybody the same thing. That's a wonderful goal, but I don't think it's realistic in it when we get to international. There's just so many variabilities. There's so many different labor laws. There's so many different regulations. It's you just can't. That's what I think. So
Yeah, and I wonder too, from a business perspective, should you? Because I mean, there are, unless you're a 501c3, there is, an expectation and a need to be able to create a profit so you can grow, so you can, provide value to your shareholders. There are many other reasons why that might be done, and I just wonder too, does it make sense from a fiduciary? Do you have a fiduciary responsibility to pay market competitive rates? But maybe those are different, and maybe you do go look for lower cost labor markets to bring folks on, rather than saying we're going to set a global pay rate and we know it's going to be this much more than we need to pay, but that's what we're going to do. I mean, because you can't really do it from the other way around. You're not going to see too many countries where the GDP is much lower, but they're going to, try to hire in the US at a lower rate. It's always going to be more expensive versus less expensive if you apply that global approach.
Well, there's another thing that often companies don't think about. We work with a lot of nonprofit humanitarian organizations, and they're all mission-driven organizations that are, whose purpose in life is to help people and make the countries in which they work better places to live. And to the extent that some of those clients are tempted and sometimes actually dollarize their salaries for local staff in economically volatile places, a topic for perhaps another day. They're actually disrupting the labor market in a major way, one that they probably don't even realize. And I can give you an example of this. If you look at the history of Mozambique, in the late 1990s, apparently the government collapsed. There was no workable local currency for a while, and most international employers of any type pulled out of the country, and the only ones that remained were international organizations like the UN and the World Bank, a couple of embassies, and some NGOs. Well, by 2003, the government had been replaced, the currency had been restored, things were back to quote normal unquote, and all the international employers started coming back into the market. Those employers that stayed during the crisis period dollarized their salaries, and to this day are still dollarized. And Mozambique is a bifurcated market for that reason, because it's very rare that we get a call from a mining company that says we're having trouble attracting talent from the nonprofit sector. That just doesn't happen in most places. But in Mozambique, because some of these nonprofits are dollarized, they're paid way, way, way over what the real market is. And this actually has a detrimental effect to the country itself, because it's disrupting the labor market in a way that they probably did not intend, particularly for mission-driven organizations that are supposed to be helping.
Yeah.
Well, it is difficult. And the other thing that we find when we're going into these, into the countries, is understanding what is all involved in their compensation. Like, they may be paid less, but then they have, education supplements or food supplements or commuting all these different pieces of the remuneration that we have to take into account to make sure that we're still focused on that total cash. I see Shilpa put that in there, and that's what kind of sparked my comment, was it total cash compensation, and getting that to work properly.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I have a question for you guys. When you help clients build salary structures internationally, which data do you use? Do you use total comp or do you use base salary?
So we look at both. And then we also pull in as much other remuneration information that we can to try to get a lay of the landscape of what we're looking at. Because a lot of the leaders sometimes that we work with just focus on that base comp. Sometimes they're not even aware there's these other things, and they just want to pay them more comp. And so we have that responsibility to show them the whole picture, to help bridge that gap in knowledge so that they can manage their workforces better.
I mean, when we work with clients, we always start with total comp. And the reason is because what we find at least in the markets that we survey, not every company follows the same pattern of pay mix. In particular, in our surveys, we have a number of organizations like the UN that don't pay any allowances and don't pay taxes. So our survey has a feature that grosses up the net payers, so you can compare gross to gross or net to net. But also, think about it. If you have an employer in the survey that is 100% base salary, doesn't pay anything else, and then you have another employer, say in a place like Cote d'Ivoire, where 40% of the total comp is base salary and the rest of it is various types of allowances and seniority premiums and bonuses. If I compare that 40% base salary to the 100% base salary, I'm going to, oh my gosh, I'm way behind the market. If I look at total comp, I may also still be behind the market, but not by nearly as much. And so the way I explain this to clients is with a pie analogy. A PIE pie. Right. So you have a pie that represents the diameter of the pie represents your market position, and your desired market position maybe is an inch bigger. So maybe you have an 8-inch pie and you want it to be a 9-inch pie. So the first step in benchmarking your comp in one of these countries is to get the pies to be the same size. And that you need to do by measuring total comp. Then you need to derive your base salary. And the base salary is basically what's left over after you take out all the other stuff. Take out your bonus, take out your allowances, take out your 13th month, take out the value of your car allowance or company cars or recreational benefits or whatever other kind of stuff is provided, and there's a whole long list of stuff. Because when you take all that stuff that's separate from base salary and add it to your base salary scale, it'll equal total comp, right? So you start with the total comp scale and you subtract out all those extras and use what's left as the basis for your monthly pay.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy.
It is. It seems easy, doesn't it? It's
does.
interesting, though, even in the United States, when I've talked with clients about total cash compensation or on target earnings, base plus bonus, real simple stuff. And they're hiring in, let's just say, a middle level finance person. And you've got your, base comp range and your total cash range. Well, their job in particular did not have any bonus attached to it inside the company, but the total cash was 20% higher. And I said, we've really got to manage to the total cash. I mean, you can tell me that you don't have a bonus problem, or a bonus for that job, but I'm going to tell you the people who are looking for the job are looking up here in that total cash area. And they thought, but we don't have bonus, so it doesn't matter. And I said, yeah, it does in a competitive market, because they're looking for that total cash overall. That's even in the United States, that's a hard thing to have a conversation with some of the leaders. And, globally, it's even a little more different for people to understand. Not an easy concept.
Yeah. And Warren, I'd be curious too, as we think of total cash, but there are different components that go into total cash. And when I believe, in my experience, I've seen that some countries, the cash is king. Other countries, really, there's a big, heavy focus on equity. Others are looking at other parts of variable pay. Others are looking at allowances. When you have a company that's managed from the top, from a global company with a single point of where the compensation programs are coming down, have you seen any approaches where, that they need to come back and say, hey, we're just going to be looking at, cash for this country, equity for this country, and just changing the pay mixes by country and by culture?
Well, I think that for most global organizations, you would want to have sort of, again, if you think about the high level pay philosophy, that's where you get into, do we have equity pay? Do we have, and which levels does it cover, and things like that. But I think when you actually get down into the individual countries and have to execute a philosophy, again, I would still stick by my pie analogy. Like if I go to 3 different countries and we've said we want to be competitive at this level of the market on a total cash basis, and then in one market there's 5 allowances that exist only in that country, then I take those into account in setting my salary scale, and I'm being consistent with my global philosophy because I'm using total comp with the segment of the market that I've said I'm going to use. I'm being equitable because I'm treating people in different countries in a similar manner according to a prescribed policy. I have a global grading system across the world, so I know that I'm valuing jobs equally regardless of the geography that they're in. But I'm also adapting to the local market to the extent that's required, at least to the extent required by law, if not by culture and practice. Here's another example of why this is really important. If you have an organization that does not provide a lot of allowances in a developing country, they say, I am only going to provide what's required by law. So I have a 13th month and a 14th month, and that's it. If the prevailing practice among other companies with whom they're competing is to provide a vacation allowance or a car allowance or and anything else kind of allowance, if you try to recruit people from those other companies, and they come to sit down with you, and you say, well, here's your salary, and it's a bigger salary because you're only providing those two extra months, and the other companies are providing, I don't know, 5 extra months. Most employees are going to say, okay, this is good. This is a higher base salary than what I was making before. But what about all this other stuff that I get now? Which is why focusing employees and managers on total compensation as opposed to base salary only is really, really critical. And it may not make a lot of sense to not provide those allowances that the market provides because of this reason. And there's another thing, which is a deep secret, perhaps among, except maybe among comp and benefits professionals, and that is, in many cases, if you introduce an allowance instead of having a higher base salary, it saves the company money because there are many pay-related benefits that are calculated solely on base salary. So it's actually a disadvantage to employees. So if you're like negotiating with a labor union or with an employee group, and they say, well, we want more allowances, you can say, all right, look, the pie is the same size as has always been. I can have as many slices as you want of different stuff. But remember, your life insurance benefit and your retirement benefits, those are going to be based on your base salary. So if you decrease your base salary by adding an allowance, you're decreasing your retirement. Still want to do that?
Yeah, that's a really, really important point, Warren. I don't think a lot of people understand that. And that's a really, really important point.
Just following Warren's point here, what I see normally, at least in the regions that we have coverage, is that people will always go for cash. That's their main concern. They don't see things in the future. They want to have it at this moment, and they want to spend it at this moment. So that's that it goes to some of the things that we discussed in previous panels, which is the compensation philosophy of the company. How much you want to protect your companies in your employees in the future, and if you want to really go for cash at this moment. So that's a big discussion, at least in the regions that we have: Central America, Caribbean, and Mexico. And my suggestion is go for a long-term perspective, to be seduced by the immediate obtainance of cash. Go beyond what people are expecting at this very moment, and try to support your people throughout time. That's my suggestion here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it depends, right, on what jobs you're trying to fill and how sophisticated the folks are who are in those jobs. Some of the companies that I work with sometimes will have just 1, 2, or 3 people in another country, and they're very sophisticated. They understand like all the allowances and all the potential slices of pie that are available to them. Whereas in country, sometimes you may find folks who are not as aware. If you're hiring at the really basic level, you might find people who aren't aware. Maybe they've often worked, off the books or something. They may not be as aware of some of the other allowances that folks get.
Well, let me ask you this question. Have you ever had a situation where an employee came to you and said, I don't want to make that much base because it's going to impact my receipt of these other allowances? Can you
I
drop my
actually had
base
that happen in the
salary?
US.
Right? Can you drop my base salary because I'm not going to get
Because
A and B if my salary is that high? Has anyone had that?
The closest that I've had to that is our admin person in New York, who
In the United States.
who's in a rent stabilized apartment,
Yeah.
and has to report her income, and said, hey, could you pay me less, because if you pay me more, I'm going to have to pay more in rent.
Yeah. And I've seen that happen
it
in the
does
US. I
happen, yes.
haven't. Yeah. Have you seen it overseas, Jaime?
Yes, you do. Particularly the higher level organization where taxation, it just goes. Remember that in developing countries, taxation it's a way of equalizing income throughout society. So the higher you go, of course, the greater the the taxes you're going to pay. So there's a certain position where you jump from, I don't know, around 22% to 35%, just to three or $4,000 in a difference. So those guys will no, just leave me like that, or pay me not by cash or any other means, and I'll be happy with that. Just give me a nice car, for example, which is not taxable.
Yeah. I've seen it happen here in the US where people they qualify for a particular, like a health plan, for example. And if they make a little bit more money, they no longer qualify for the subsidized health plan. And so they will refuse pay increases. So because a pay increase just ends up actually costing them more money net. So that's a real thing here with some of our lower paid employees. Certainly when you get, up into the $50,000-$70,000 range, you're past that. But when you're down at minimum wage here, it's a big problem.
Yeah, no, I've experienced that in Seattle as well. So, I mean, it was a housing subsidy that somebody would lose if we, provided an additional couple of $1,000s per year. It's such an interesting challenge, but it does kind of bring us to the question around, benefits across different countries and what kind of other benefits are expected. I think when we look globally, different countries, different countries have different levels of benefits that they're providing, and I think this also goes into play. When I've seen some folks that they're looking for benchmarks in a particular country they may not have, so they just do a currency conversion. We'll take like, oh well, here's what I've got data for Seattle. Vancouver's not too far away, so we'll just convert that to Canadian dollars. But that's a big no-no because of the different kinds of benefits that may exist from different countries. And I wonder if I've certainly seen people attempt to do that. I'm guessing that everybody else in the panel has as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you see folks that are looking to do that, what kind of guidance have you found to be successful when they are looking for additional data that maybe they can't find aside from going to look for a salary survey? How do we kind of coach them away from that approach?
Justin, are you talking about when an individual comes to you and asks you, how should I think about this? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I was specifically referring to either HR teams or compensation teams that are, lacking some data for other countries, but they're trying to approach, just using a, U.S. data and then applying a currency conversion to find kind of what those folks, what they would think they would pay.
Oh, geez, Louise, I just talked to Warren, get him, this makes me so crazy because let me just get on my soapbox for a minute. Companies are so penny wise and pound foolish. Let's say you have a $100 million company and 50% of your expenses are going to salaries every year. So that's $50 million, right? And they whinge and whine and complain about a $3 million or a $3,000 spend for some salary survey on a $50 million annual expense. Nowhere else in corporate America, nowhere else in corporations globally are we going to whine about spending $3,000 to make sure that a $50 million spend is appropriate. It's a rounding error. I'm sorry, I just had to say that. It makes me crazy.
Well, beyond that, if people really think that you could just take a U.S. salary or a U.S. salary structure, even worse, and just convert it based on currency and stick it into another place in the world, that's just stupid. It indicates that you really haven't done your research. You really don't know how to do this, and you should get some professional help. Hey, we're here. That's what we do. It's just nuts. I have one example, one client that is had a system in place that they basically were paying everybody around the world on a U.S. pay scale, but with adjustments because they had created their own sort of homegrown adjustments based on relative cost of living, which we know is not really that relevant. And so we've we tried to convince them that this was the errors of their ways, and that they shouldn't be doing this, and that yes, we could design something that was more sensible. And they convinced us that actually it was actually right for them. And so this is to say there are some cases where, and the way I would phrase it is, if the talent that you're going after is very senior level talent, and they could exist anywhere in the world, and they could command an international level salary from any other competing organization, then you're trying to reach a very, very particular group of folks, and a global pay range might make sense in that case. But for most organizations who are not trying to attain those lofty levels of reach into the global market, a local approach works better. And in this particular client's case, as soon as their new CEO is on board, they're going to implement a new methodology, which is still going to be largely based on a blend of global markets, but with a location premium that varies by essentially cost of living measures. One of the interesting things about it is that there's no negative location allowances. Like, even though the data that's been used to set the salaries is essentially North American and Western European market data, it's discounted to a point where everybody can be in the same salary range, and the location allowance can only be positive. Then that just avoids problems when people move from Germany to Ethiopia. The salary stays the same, but the location premium goes away, as opposed to, I'm going to reduce your salary by 30%.
And following Warren's comment, just to give you an example, that you shouldn't be seeing only the region as a whole. For example, Mexico. This is a 120 million people country, with differences of development as high as Ghana from one side, and Norway on the other side, as different as that. If you think about that, just put it on the region perspective. You have salaries of different ranges from 40 to 50% on the Mexico compared to Northern Mexico. So if you go for just a single survey, which is a regional composite or an average survey, it's not going to work for you, because the differences are so big, so huge, that you need to even not think about Mexico locally, but also think about the region specific of where your location is going to be, which is completely different from one side to another. So that it takes you another level in terms of the equation. It makes it much more complicated.
And not just in
It generally sounds like for all of this, just broadly on the conversation, is if you can't get people who are familiar with new countries or the country you're in, you need to get help, right? I mean, this is, broadly speaking, you either need people who know the market locally or who have worked in these countries, or and go find that. I think anybody who's considering going into a new country, again, just I think the summary of this is there's more to it than just adjusting your range, right? There's a lot more complexities there. And again, if you're listening to, if you're on the conversation, you probably already understand that. But if you're on this because your company's thinking about our global, it's way more complicated than you think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dare I add another level of complexity to this discussion?
Of course.
So we're all, of course, very familiar now with the concept of remote work and remote first organizations. My organization is one such organization. So is Justin's, as I recall. How do you deal with setting pay for global nomads, or for maybe not even global nomads, but simply you hire somebody in Norway, you hire somebody in Switzerland, you hire somebody in Ethiopia? How are you going to figure out how to pay them? Assuming all the regulatory and compliance stuff is handled, that you're using an EOR or PEO or you have an entity in those places. How do you set their pay and benefits? And unfortunately, I hear a lot of folks saying, "Oh, well, we just use our U.S. or our UK scale," and really, you sure you want to do that? And if somebody is being paid, let's say you have somebody hired in your Swiss office. Switzerland has among the highest salaries in the entire world, and they move to a low-cost country. Do they keep their Swiss salary? What's your policy on that as a company? Where do you stand? Do you reduce their salary? Do you pay them, as if they're Ethiopian, if they move to Ethiopia? And I choose Ethiopia because it's a low-cost country in this example. And is it different if the company suggests the move versus the employee saying, "Hey, I want to move. I don't like living where I'm living anymore. I'm going to move someplace else." And it could be, the same thing. You could have the same conversation about people who just move from one state to another in the U.S. If you don't have a national pay scale, should you apply geographic differentials or not? And under what circumstances? And I don't necessarily think that there's only one answer to this, except that you should have a policy that says what you're going to do. There can be variations. There can be different solutions that are right for your organization that might be wrong for mine. But if you don't have a written policy that really thinks it through, then you're going to have a mess. And one more quick example: we had an employer, an NGO employer that was operating in, I think, 67 countries around the world, and during COVID, they hired someone in Norway, which was not an operational country. And they struggled to figure out how much to pay that person. And at the end, coming out of COVID, as they looked at how many incidents of hiring people in places where they weren't registered occurred, they made a decision that they weren't going to do that anymore. That each job was going to be evaluated as to whether or not it was a fixed location job, a regional location job, or a global location, a flexible location. But the flexible location, the most generous categorization would be this job can be done from anywhere. But they defined anywhere as anywhere where we're registered.
Yeah, because there's a huge cost to being registered in any country. And that's a big problem if people aren't aware of it. Yeah.
And a huge cost of not being registered and operating illegally in a country.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Cost everywhere.
Yeah. And also the backlash from your donors, from your service partners, and so on.
Sure. And for those of you in the corporate world, just Google permanent establishment. Become familiar with that term and get to know your corporate tax folks.
Yeah, and I will say too, World at Work has actually done some really interesting research on this topic. So, in one of their more recent articles, they found that 11%, or about 17 million U.S. Workers, identified as being digital nomads. It doesn't go into the level of detail to suggest if they're global nomads or if they, are I don't know the right way to say it, but the folks that are living in a van going to different national parks, because I know that's become a lot more popular over the past several years. But there are some really interesting studies, and I'll put those in the chat. But one was published in June of 2022, and it's called Geographic Pay Policies, and it has a number of different key findings saying that 28% of organizations are going to modify their policies through the consolidation of pay differentials. Not that many organizations have found that geographic pay policies are ineffective for reducing turnover, and many companies can say they expect to see a continued increase in remote work, and that's going to drive employees looking to find new relocations and new relocation programs. But I do think that we will continue to see these challenges proliferate And I think, Warren, to your point, if you are not ready for it, and if you don't have a policy around that, you are going to find yourself in trouble, both retaining and potentially from a tax situation or a legal situation.
And it's
Definitely.
defining, isn't it? Defining a little bit what that means, that digital nomad. Is it just you're staying there for a couple weeks, or are you going there for 6 months, or are you going there, what exactly does that mean? Because that has an impact, in the United States in particular, if you're in a certain place for a certain length of time, taxes need to be considered in that particular location. So it's not only about being a digital nomad, but it's about defining what that means and what you will support as an organization.
And also then what laws apply if you're going to be in Seattle, for example. We have paid sick leave here, which doesn't happen most of the rest of the US. And so if you're here, we have to comply with that. And if you're not here, we have to do something different, or we have to at least consider some other options. I'm really curious, Justin and Warren, how are you guys handling this with your staff on a global basis? If you don't mind, I didn't mean to call you out, but I'm really curious because, like, I have somebody that I have working out of Portugal, and it's always, do I pay US? Do I not? What do we do here?
Well, I can tell you, most of our staff, first of all, are based in the Philippines. We have about 175 people there, and we only have a handful of people outside of that. Right? We have one in Geneva, we have one in Savannah, Georgia, a couple in the New York area, and
So they're not everywhere.
And one in Canada. Well, what we've said is that for the rank and file jobs that we have, the ones that are based in the Philippines, we're flexible within the Philippines. So we used to only hire people in Metro Manila. Now, we have some folks who we've hired outside of the Metro Manila area, that are not commutable. Like they have to take a plane from the provinces to get to Manila. We've had occasionally requests for people to, work remotely for a very limited period of time, a couple of weeks, in Singapore or San Francisco. And, that's just sort of under the table. We're going to look the other way and make believe that you're on a long vacation. But for those who, we've had people who've relocated from the Philippines to Canada, for example. And then depending on what job they were in, we make a decision as to whether or not, we can afford to continue to employ them. Because if we do employ them, to answer your question, the person in Canada is paid as a Canadian. The person in Switzerland, unfortunately, is paid as a Swiss national. He's our most expensive employee in the world. And so, there's not the intent to pay people on a global pay scale, but on a local pay scale. And so I guess if I were going to summarize it really succinctly, we decide which places are of interest for us to have people. And if we're able to find somebody there, we're going to pay them on the local basis. And if somebody from our existing team emigrates, which happens a lot from the Philippines, they have to be a senior level person for us to even consider maintaining their employment, because we just can't afford to do it the other way.
Okay.
Good point.
Yeah, and we're a much smaller company than Birch's Group, but we do look at those on a case-by-case basis and really have to evaluate each potential move, each potential employee that may not be either based in the U.S. or not a U.S. citizen, and define what's the right approach for us to do that. In some cases, we can essentially leverage like a contract relationship versus a full-time employee relationship, and we found that to be an effective way to still bring on the right people, but to kind of avoid some of the other challenges that may come from a compliance and a taxing perspective. But I think to Warren's earlier point, and to Greg's summary, it is very important to make sure that you go into it with your eyes open and understand it is a very complex thing to move into different countries, and without doing your due diligence, you could find yourself in some trouble down the road.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Christine.
Oh, fantastic.
I'm sorry, just to add to that final comment, Justin, and trust your local people, trust your local employees. That's one of the reasons that you have a group of people, with local perspective. So do listen to them, which is I think is very important.
That I think is a great point. We've had, in my past, countries where we've operated that didn't have a compensation team, but they had HR partners in place. And those HR partners were typically very aware of the local requirements and could really kind of help to act as those guardrails for when compensation programs were maybe not aligned with, what was going to resonate with employees. So that's a great point, Jaime. Well,
I see in the chat there was a question about high tech clients, and it looks like startups in Series A to D, and they're trying to find fully diluted percentages outside the U.S. And I'll just make a pitch for the Birches Group. That's where most people start.
I mean, we don't have a lot of tech in our data, but that's because there's not necessarily a lot of tech in, depending on the country, right? There are some countries where there is, but there's a lot that are not. But we don't have a lot of information on equity, and I'm trying to think. We have one or two companies that I guess would be considered startups. One of them is Chipper Cash, which is an electronic payments company that covers 8 or 10 countries in Africa, for example. So it really depends on which countries you're looking at. But happy to research it for you.
And then Radford would be the other tech go-to, I think, right?
Yeah, Radford has. My understanding is that we used to have a partnership with Aon, so I have some inside information. But Radford publishes their data periodically during the year, and the number of countries that they publish depends on the depth of the data that's available in that country. But they actually have data that they can't publish in some other countries,
Right.
So they can sometimes piece together something for you.
And I think that'll evolve, right? Because we're just really new into getting into some of these countries and getting that data. So we got to use Creative Comp in that case.
Yeah, the more global we go as our workforce, the more data we'll have, the more information we'll have. But right now, it's kind of the Wild West in some countries.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, this is a really fantastic conversation. And again, many thanks to Warren Heaps from the Birches Group for joining us and sharing his just wealth of knowledge about global compensation practices. And again, thanks to Catherine Doby, Sound Compensation, Sherry Nornes from Morgan HR, Jaime Morfin from Sweldos.com, and then Greg Roche. Sorry. But again, yeah, thank you guys again for joining us for today's Pay Practitioners panel. And we will look forward to joining you guys in 2 weeks. And until then, have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.